take a data-driven approach, really understanding industry needs and then matching the supply with the demand in the region. And so that's partly about asking what your region's competitive advantage is, and then also how the workforce system can meet those needs. A second best practice was looking at the different components of the workforce system overall and identifying who does what the best so that it helps to reduce duplication. And the great example that Scott gave us was resume writing. There are so many different organisations, community-based organisations, workforce development organisations which offer resume writing. If you can find out who does that best and then outsource that to that specific group in the system, there's much less duplication and it's a much more integrated approach. And then the third best practice was really understanding what's in your toolkit. So not just going to industry and saying, this is what we can offer, but asking them what they need and then knowing what the other value-added services that you can provide beyond just kind of the standard offering. So really thinking creatively about other services you can offer, because often those are ones which industry will be very happy to pay for as well. So it's a good way of supporting financially the system overall. Looking at what's working already in our region, certainly some of the data dive into occupations and the market needs in the East Bay. The EDA report is a great starting point for that, and we already have our nice cluster graph in that report. We talked about the apprenticeship model, which is successful in a number of areas, and particularly the healthcare sector here in the East Bay has really been focused on the job training and other kind of tacit learning models, so that's something which we can really kind of start maybe taking and scaling to other sectors. And then Nick shared with us that Alameda County has just released, the Workforce Investment Police has released an RFP to do a full environmental scan of all the different regional job trainers so that we can start addressing across the board this need to create a true one-stop and have a much more integrated system by doing the first part of that, which is getting the baseline data to understand who's out there and what they're doing already. And then 3 concrete steps we found. Firstly, really looking at focusing on the question of what employees are doing in their first 90 days of inducting a new employee, because that's all, a lot of it is training, which will be very generic and which can be put into place before the employee even comes on board at the employer's company. And so you're really building a great model for the employers because they're not having to, they're investing with the existing workforce system rather than having to invest in doing their own training. Secondly, looking at, as we mentioned, scaling and expanding those apprenticeships or other tacit learning models beyond the digital healthcare sector in the East Bay. And then finally looking at technology solutions. So an example was electronic case records, so that we're sharing information across different agencies and having a much more integrated approach to sharing information. And the other benefit that gives is that agencies are much more easily able to work together, and so you're not making lots of different requests from different pairs in the system. You're having a much more integrated approach and going out with one voice to the business community or to industry.
The kickoff event of that last October in Oakland, a subsequent follow-up meeting in Contra Costa County in December, where we had groups talk about each of the 4 priority areas in the report around business climate, around land use, around innovation, and around education and workforce development. The latter being really the #1 economic priority of the region. And why? Because it's at the moment one of our greatest assets, but it's also one that if we don't continue to support and develop, we run the risk of losing it and losing our competitive edge. So we're really now in this phase of sort of the second tier of activities between the capacity building, this sort of middle section blue, which talks about capacity building and resource development. You just heard Randy talk about a big infusion of federal grant resources that are helping to support a lot of this work right now. So the great thing is we've lined up a lot of stuff, and we have a lot of partners with existing systems and programs that are ready to plug in. The challenging part now is, of course, we have to deliver. And so really the key thing now is about organizing all this work around the imperatives of business. And you heard Kish talk to it very well. You heard our panelists talk about it earlier. This is really about a demand-driven strategy and about really listening to the input of employers. East Bay EDA, with their business leadership, has formed a employer advisory group that's been meeting now for a few months to really talk about some of these issues in earnest. Obviously, there's many groups out there, the Contra Costa Council's Workforce Education Task Force, the 4 workforce boards in the region, and also the 5th up in Solano. A lot of us are really working around a lot of these issues right now, and we know very clearly that we have to organize this around the business community and specifically around business about industry sectors and clusters that are driving our region's growth. And so that's really what's led us to this point, and I know we want to now be able to have a chance to have a little bit of dialogue up here and get some questions from you all, to talk a little bit about the significance of this as we move it forward.
Straps, trying to find ways to meet their kind of human resource needs, to find the workers they need to actually enable that growth and expansion. I think it's really where we're going to see the biggest bang for our buck.
Yeah, I think, the other thing to keep in mind is, we're trying to be very thoughtful about where we focus efforts, and, actually I wanted to use the prerogative of being up here to sort of ask something of Kish too, which I talk about more, having to do with sort of the notion of what we're doing regionally and how it can help support some of the state's agenda in terms of some of the things he outlined already around export and trade and so forth, and really what we can do to best leverage that sort of regional state partnership and make sure that we're aligning those efforts, because that's a key piece of my estimation.
Well, and yeah, I'm glad that you asked me. It's a general topic that I want to say is that our work in Sacramento is obviously we're very focused on trying to drive the right policies from the state government's perspective. But so much of this, it has to happen outside of Sacramento. It has to happen locally, and it has to happen regionally. And I can say specifically that I want to be able to get the full benefit of the wonderful work that's happening in all of our regions through groups like the East Bay DA and your counterparts all across the state, and through things like the Rio Coalition where you all are collaborating together. That's really...
And that's where the bulk of the energy goes with each individual that's leading a particular industry partnership. They also felt, or we also felt, that neutrality was important, and to have someone who really does not have a funding requirement, so a neutral partner who can kind of manage the partnership and the initiative. The other important thing is that came out of this was agreement about credentials. There are a lot of credentials that were issued, but there has to be common agreement as to how the WIBs, the employers, and the community college view these credentials. Let me see. The other thing was some of the strengths that we see in the East Bay are that there's an organization that is BACC, Bay Area Community College Coalition, that has 28 colleges that meet and discuss sectors. There are some specific sector initiatives, one being the healthcare sector at Merritt, the Atlas program in Peralta Community College, and also how there can be connections to the career advancement academies and career ladders. So these are some really existing programs. We also talked about an ongoing disconnect between academia and connection to the sectors, and that's something, and connection to careers, actual careers, and that's something that needs to be addressed. And then the last item that was brought up was, how do you make sure that formerly incarcerated individuals are getting selected for careers where they can really advance, and what sort of supports do they need? And we talked a little bit about transitional job models. And if there's anything that I forgot and somebody from that particular session wants to chime in, I'm, open to that.
Okay, and finally we have Trina Ostrander who's going to come up and report out on the LA model.
So we found the most relevant elements of the LA model after a lot of questions going to Alma. were, first of all, the presence of a strong, well-defined intermediary organization to connect the sectors, particularly with the business world. Secondly, the understanding that it worked best when there's a focus on business, where business is leading the discussion and the operations. We had a discussion about a little bit deeper on that level about how it seems to work best when it's one sector at a time instead of just a broad business focus. One thing that we were impressed with was we asked a lot of questions of Alma about what was that leadership organization, that made it work in such a complicated, large community. And it was the neutral, kind of safe organization that they formed, and the fact that it also provided leadership. It didn't just convene, it led in a complex community like that. And then the last piece, we said we'd do 3, but we did 4, was, as many other groups have reported, was the data-driven, particularly driving the data to make it clear to business why they should get involved, what everybody has to gain with that. We had a discussion about the local applications of the 3 presentations. We had a big conversation about whether it would be best to do it here by doing it within the East Bay or whether it ought to be Bay Area wide. In looking to leadership organizations such as maybe ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, or the Bay Area Council, or the East Bay Economic Development Alliance, which has already laid such groundwork here. We didn't come to a resolution on that. And then the other thing was a focus on bringing all the different sectors together, whether it be K-12, community colleges, different businesses, organized by sector, and all that. There was a lot of discussions about who had to be part of the effort, and it was pretty broad. And then we had a wrap up about the key next steps that we could imagine. One was to just bring employers to the table, again in a way that makes them feel ownership of the effort. And again, that could be sector by sector. It's probably worth it. We feel that we have a good start here in the East Bay with that. All the players, and then really developing an action plan for how an intermediary infrastructure would work, kind of thing.